Hey everyone, Adam here with another RimWorld guide. Every RimWorld player should know the basics of RimWorld combat, and the game doesn't do a great job of teaching you. In this RimWorld guide, we're going to try to cram as much as we can into about 10 minutes, but there's tons more detail for each and every topic we may expand on in other guides later down the road. First, in order to control your colonists in combat, you will need to draft them. Select one or more colonists, press the cross swords or draft button, or by default the R key. When drafted, you have much more precise control of your colonists. Drafted colonists will have underlined names on the colonist bar. In general, you should draft and bring everyone to every threat. For example, if one of your colonists is attacked by a wild animal or hunted or a threat appears, then draft everyone and bring everyone together as soon as you can. For colonists with a ranged weapon, generally you simply want to place them in a good position and let them do their own thing. Target firing is a good thing, however, there are some potential unintuitive issues with RimWorld controls. If you select one colonist with a ranged weapon and you right-click on a target out of range or out of line of sight, you'll get a pop-up. If you select two colonists with ranged weapons and you right-click on a target outside of range or line of sight, your colonist will run up and melee the target instead. If you select one colonist with a ranged weapon, press the ranged weapon button, B by default, then select a target. They will only attempt to attack that target. If that target is out of range, they will stand still no matter what. They will even continue to stand still even when another enemy is stabbing them. Target firing can be a good thing, however, keep those potential pitfalls in mind. In general, it's just fine to simply tell your ranged colonists to take cover and let them shoot as they like. Any creature immediately adjacent to most objects can be considered in cover. A colonist in cover is more difficult to hit with ranged fire. Select and draft one colonist with a ranged weapon. Hover the mouse over various targets in range. A pop-up will appear to show the chance to hit that target. Here's the pop-up for a target outside of cover, and here's the pop-up for a target taking cover using an adjacent wall. The pop-up shows the reduced chance to hit. Here's one target that is close to cover, but it's receiving no cover, adjacent only. You can even select enemies and see their chance to hit your own colonists. Different objects provide different amounts of cover. Walls provide the most cover. Whenever possible, use a wall for cover. The angle of cover also matters. Here's a colonist using a wall for maximum cover. Here's what happens at an angle. Chance to hit is significantly higher. Walls restrict line of sight, so walls aren't always ideal. Shooting accuracy is based on many factors: the shooter's skill level, their health conditions, whether the target is in cover or laying down or is a small size, and even the weather all affect shooting accuracy. Sometimes a target like this bunny will be frustratingly hard to hit. You're telling me I only have a 4% chance to hit? Melee can be incredibly effective in RimWorld, but you do need to get your melee fighters into hand-to-hand range. Simply running at the enemy isn't always ideal. You may have more luck letting the enemy run into you. Consider positioning your colonists around a corner, or consider having a lot of access doors and then ambushing enemies on other sides. If you select a melee fighter and right-click on an enemy to attack, your fighters will not be able to pass through allies who are in combat. If you instead click on the ground, your fighters can actually pass through allies even if they're in combat. When you place one of your colonists in melee range of an enemy, that enemy will only use their melee attacks. Melee locking, as I usually call it, can be incredibly effective against enemies like lancers. A ranged weapon fighter cannot fire their ranged weapon at enemies in melee. However, they can fire their ranged weapon at other targets while an enemy is inside their melee range. The spike trap is a great way to defeat enemies without risking your colonist. An easy way to use them is to place them diagonally off the corners of buildings. Clear away any trees or chunks near the trap. Now you can run around your building and lure enemies into those traps. A too-wide spike trap tunnel allows your colonists to walk around traps. You can use fences to guide enemies toward traps, or floors to lure enemies into traps, or both. I'll have another guide that goes over this in more detail at a later time. Hallway fighting. Every hallway can be an effective defensive position. Standing in the doorways and firing down the hallway allows you to have maximum cover, and the enemies no cover. The doors themselves don't provide anything, but do allow you to use the adjacent wall as cover. We can add doors to our spike trap hallway to allow optional firing down the hallway. Fences provide only a very small amount of cover, and wooden fences are quickly destroyed. If the enemies start firing back and we don't want to trade blows in the hallway, you can simply step inside, let the door shut, and the enemies will walk into the spike traps. Around corners. Standing around a corner allows you to concentrate a huge amount of fire on the one enemy who enters. Be careful though, because enemies are going to have great shots on you from close range. You also can use cover in the doorway. Be ready to step forward with a colonist to melee lock that enemy. You can improve this strategy by laying out simple walls for your colonists to have maximum cover. Here's an example with cover walls just to the side. Here's an example with cover walls head on. In both examples, you probably want to be ready to step forward for the melee lock if needed. Let's talk about melee blocking. The melee block is an incredible tactic against all melee enemies like animals, insects, scythers, or even all melee humans. Choose a doorway or one square opening at the location where you want one single enemy to stand. Place up to 3 melee blockers adjacent to this one square. Behind these melee blockers, you can place ranged attackers up to 4 deep. This example has 12 ranged fighters behind 3 melee blockers. Friendly fire isn't possible at this range. I have an entire separate guide on friendly fire that you can check out for more detail if you want. A melee blocking setup like this means only enemies in the one square opening can attack at a time. It's incredibly effective against all melee foes. Let's talk about some ambush tactics. Improvised ambush tactics can also be very effective. When possible, melee lock an enemy alone and then blast from short range. You can use doors to ambush such an enemy, then use a door to escape before reinforcements arrive. Ambushes like this allowed you to take on terrifying foes even with poor weapons. If you remove all pathable targets, enemies will start attacking random walls and doors. Let's close this held open door and see what happens. As you can see, the enemies now spread out, and that allows for easier ambushes. Ambush tactics work best with a too thick stone wall. The stone wall has higher hit points and isn't flammable. The too thick wall means that when enemies break the first wall, they still don't have a path into the base. Very briefly, we'll touch on kill boxes. The condensed explanation of the essentials of a kill box is creating a defensive line of alternating walls and barricades or sandbags, standing your colonists behind the walls when possible. It's best to try to keep 1 or 2 rows, but 3 can work. Restrict the entrance to the kill box like so. A bend prevents enemies from firing from far away. Barricades, sandbags, fences, columns, etc. can prevent the enemy from pathing and stopping at these squares intentionally. But they can take damage and stop here, or bump into each other and stop here. Alternating barricades or fences can be used to slow down enemies. Columns can be used to allow the enemies to move at full speed while still preventing direct pathing. The kill box works most effectively when you have enough firepower to immediately kill the first enemy who enters. Early in the game, you may not have enough firepower to do that. That means in the early game, if you're wanting to use a kill box, you want to use something like this instead. Let's try the same raid again using our hallway and the around the corner setup. Even bad shooters with bad weapons are rather effective at this very short range. This setup is much more effective in the early game. The downside is that the people in the front tend to get stabbed quite a few times. I'd now like to mention a little bit about kiting and sniping. Using weapons like the bolt action rifle and sniper rifle allow you to kite or snipe the enemies. Simply stay out of their range and damage them without repercussion. Kiting is another great option against especially dangerous foes like centipedes. Again, I'll have another guide on this you can check out later. A note about weapon selection. Weapon selection in RimWorld is very complicated and highly depends on your defensive setup, your colonists, and the quality of the weapon options available. For instance, you can get something like a heavy SMG relatively early and relatively cheaply, and it can do great. In the late game, chain shotguns rule at the short range. Mid-range in the late game is dominated by charge rifles and miniguns. And if you want slightly more range but slightly less damage, assault rifles are king. For kiting or sniping, bolt actions or sniper rifles make those things pretty easy. For melee weapons, you can craft a uranium mace. The plasteel longsword is also a fine choice, but the uranium mace has advantages of being blunt damage, requiring less research, and not using the more in-demand plasteel. With that, we might as well touch on armor selection a little bit. The sort of standard RimWorld clothing layout is a duster made out of the best material you can find, a button-down shirt, and a flak vest. Either flak pants or regular pants are fine, and the best helmet you can make. At times in the late game, you might consider changing into power armor, especially for melee fighters. I do get the question a lot if flak is really as good as recon armor. Just think of a flak vest as strapping marine armor to the chest. What about the basics of breachers and sappers, I hear you say? Well, those get actually pretty complicated, so we're going to hit those up in the Advanced Combat Techniques guide that'll be coming up soon. And I think that does it. That's about all the basic RimWorld combat tactics that I can cram into a video of this length. As mentioned throughout this guide though, I do intend to expand on many of these concepts into their own mini guides. If you enjoyed this basic combat RimWorld guide, or it helped you out at all, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, leaving a comment down below, and sharing it with others. If you'd like to reference a written version of the guide, be sure to head over to my website, adamversuseverything.com/guides. You can also find a playlist of guides on the channel. There's a link to that in the description and the pinned comment. There are guides for experts, for beginners, and everyone in between. As always, thank you for watching.